Thanks for this introduction, Cyprian. One of the most important speakers, I'm not too sure about that. I think the important thing here is all of us being here together, the team putting together an amazing program, many interesting speakers, having a lot of interesting conversations, and things like this, events like this, is where we all sort of get the opportunity to have or to own the narrative of the future's conversations that we want to have, and I think that's very, very powerful for sure. My name is Simon. Cyprian sort of did the brief introduction to me already. I work for the Copenhagen Institute for Future Studies. We are one of the world's oldest futurist think tanks in the world, something we're really, really proud of. We have more than 50 years experience in working with everything futures related. Super happy to be here today. What I'm going to talk about is more about bringing futures thinking into strategy, what I would call strategic foresight, and less about just being super futuristic and talking about all of the trends that are going to change all of the world and transform all of our lives all of the time. So I'm sort of going to zoom in much more on a systematic way of trying to make sense of the future and trying to sort of convey its importance to present-day decision-making. So I hope you're with me, and if you experienced, or if you expected, me to stand on this stage and just tell you about all of the crazy stuff that will change everything, then you came to the wrong gig. All right, let's see if this works. Yeah, and let me break this to you already now. Working with strategic foresight is about much more than being able just to identify trends, specifically technological trends that we will hear about quite a lot today and the next days. For me, when it's about strategizing, it is all about strategic uncertainty. It is all about the friction that new trends and new developments and new trajectories, wildcards, unexpected events and whatnot. It's all about the friction that creates in the current environment and the uncertainty that comes from that. So I think it's at the very core of working strategically with the future is acknowledging the simple fact that uncertainty is something that we need to understand and something that we need to grasp. And uncertainty is the very reason that we need strategies, isn't it? Because without uncertainty, more or less you just needed a plan to go from A to B. So that's why I'm saying that uncertainty, we need to acknowledge that as a feature and not as a bug. I am having a difficulty to see if you guys are nodding here, but I saw one on the first row nodding, so he acknowledges the fact that uncertainty is not a bug, it's a feature. I think it's super, super important, at least when working with strategic foresight, which I'm trying to convey to you today. But why do we even want to study the future? Why do we even want to work systematically with the future? The future's not just going to come, isn't it? First of all, I want to say that there's multiple futures. You see it in our name, the Copenhagen Institute for Futures Studies. So think about the future in plural all of the time. That also means that we actually do have choices, and we do have things we can do to sort of take control and steer the future, at least our own future and broader futures in general, in the directions that we want to sort of do it. Then the future is a super important tool. Not necessarily a destination, but think about the future as a super important tool to sort of challenge mental models. All of our mental models need to be challenged. The organizational mental models needs to be challenged. We're seeing all of the time, many of the organizations that I work with, there's always some level of contentment, some sort of conventional wisdom that needs to be challenged, some awareness that needs to be expanded, because organizations, just like most of us here, we have the tendency to sort of favor the business as usual future, right? That's what we want to sort of avoid when we try to leverage the future in strategic ways. So we want to challenge mental models, and we want to sort of refresh misguided assumptions and obsolete images of what the future might look like. Essentially what we're trying to do, and please stay with me here, it might be a little bit difficult to grasp, but what we're not doing is trying to make sense of the future with the views from the present. So we're not trying to be here in the present and say, this is how the future will unfold. In strategic foresight, you're sort of trying to invert that process a little bit. So we're trying to sort of learn about the present with the lens of the future. So we're trying to sort of venture out in the future, learn from that, build scenarios maybe, different ways that the future might unfold, and then the insights that we gain from that, taking that back to inform the present, rather than the other way around. You see that? Good? And again, the whole point around not just being able to identify all the cool trends that might challenge us or that might enable us to do new things, it really is about acknowledging this systems thinking way of approaching the future, because we know for a fact that prediction is the only thing about prediction about the future is that we know we're going to get it wrong at some point, right? So as a strategic foresight practitioner, I'm calling myself a strategic foresight practitioner and not necessarily a futurist. In my line of business, we're not trying to do predictions. We're trying to work systematically with the future because we realize that it's about systems thinking, different trends, different developments coming together in very, very complex ways, unfolding in unexpected ways that we simply just can't grasp if we're trying to extrapolate the present into the future. Okay? Super, super ugly slide. Sorry for that, but it actually is my favorite ugly slide. Super conceptual, important way of framing what strategic foresight is and how it relates to strategy. So please look behind sort of the ugly interface of this slide and listen to my message instead. Strategic foresight is what you sort of have on the left here, where we're trying to do just what I said, trying to learn from the future to inform the present. But strategic foresight in itself is not strategy. Strategic foresight, together with sort of the present-day strategic operational things that we need to tend to in our organizations, provides what I would call strategy input. Right? So we're using strategic foresight to strengthen the decision-making input that we get to then inform the decisions that we need to make. So in strategic foresight, we're looking sort of at the external environment, the transactional environment, what it is that changes around our organization, how we can leverage that, how we can sort of utilize that as input to inform the decision-making. So it's super important to say that even if you're just doing foresight, the power of foresight for strategic decision-making is in its application, right? Foresight without strategy very, very easily just becomes speculation or sort of conjecture connected from purpose, you would say. Whereas strategy without foresight very, very easily becomes disconnected from change and might very well become sort of a recipe for failure when change occurs. Right? So that's what I'm trying to say is this happy marriage between strategy and foresight into strategic foresight to inform the decisions that we need to make. Very conceptual, super ugly slide, but super, super important point. Some of you might have seen this conceptual slide before. We call it the futures cone. Again, futures in plural. And it sort of helps convey the message that the further we sort of get away from the present, the wider the outcome space sort of gets, right? It also helps convey the message that we are looking towards multiple futures because different futures can play out in different ways. So let's say that we go towards 2035. 2035 is sort of becoming the new 2030 these days, at least in my line of business, I would say. The probable future, sort of the most narrow outcome space you see, is more or less about likelihood and about prediction or projections, you would say. So those are sort of an extrapolation of the most likely future that we see based on current and past trends. When I work with the future as a strategic foresight practitioner, we most often focus on the plausible outcome space, sort of the dotted line you see here. So we're trying to be explorative around what could play out, what could plausibly happen. We're not trying to predict what we think will happen. We're also not necessarily trying to be too normative around preferable futures, to say, this is what we wish will happen. That, of course, can be super, super powerful if you're working with visioning or sort of setting strategic direction and whatnot. But in the profession of strategic foresight, it's important to be agnostic about the future. And there might be futures out there that you don't like as an organization, and you don't want to be blind to those futures. That's what I'm saying, that we're trying to be explorative in the way that we approach the future. Let's see, can we change? Maybe I need some help from the top to change the slide. Mm-hmm. It's uncertainty. You never know what's going to happen when you step on a stage. Okay, so I want to be on this slide right here. It basically tells the same story, the same message as I told you before, that it's about systems thinking. It's about not just being able to identify trends at face value, so to speak. That's fairly easy to identify a trend and try to sort of understand that trend, map that trend, what are some of the implications. But what really happens is that the future always will unfold in this sort of friction field in the middle, right? So when we have new trends or new developments that we see, technological trends, societal trends, political trends, events, COVID, the war in Europe, whatever, it creates friction to the current state, to the current environment. And it's within that friction that the future will unfold. We will be seeing drivers and enablers that are sort of, giving momentum to a dynamic of change. We will also be seeing turners and blockers that are sort of trying to divert or turn the development. So that is why I'm always saying that we need to sort of look under the hood a little bit of the trends and try to understand the dynamics of change. What is it that really drives change before we can then try to grasp what the implications might be. Okay? Make sense? Good? Super important. Trends are fun. Trends are important. We need to understand them. We need to be able to identify them. But we also need to be aware that it's about dynamics of change more than just being able to take trends at face value. Right? Things happen in the intersections. I need help again to change the slide, please. Here we go. Delay intuition. This is something that I stole or borrowed from hotshot Daniel Kahneman. Go read his books. He's a very, very smart behavioral economic scientist, psychologist, whatever it is he called. And delayed intuition is something that really resonates with me and in my line of business, because all of us sort of have an intuitive way of approaching the future or approaching any given problem. So if there's a problem presented in front of us, we use our intuition to go directly into solve mode. So there's this problem, we want to solve it, right? What we're essentially trying to do with strategic foresight is that we want to delay that intuitive response a little bit, because we need to learn from the future first. We need to be comfortable exploring the future, discovering the future, understanding the future, maybe sort of building different scenarios, different images of the future. So we need to delay our intuition to allow for more input, to allow for more insight, so we make better decisions, right? That essentially is what strategic foresight is about. That's how you're able to bring futures thinking into strategy. Super, super easy to talk about, super, super difficult to actually do in practice. Because it's about cognitive biases, it's about humans' way of sort of being, right? And that is why I want to introduce you to the concept of reperception. Weird word, I know. It's this guy, Pierre Wack. He was one of the pioneers in strategic foresight. He used to work for Shell back in the days. Shell were actually some of the very first private corporations that incorporated scenario planning for strategy. And he sort of framed this term about reperception. So being able to actually let go of position to be aware of the possibility that the future might be different from the past, or different from the present, or even different from how I would expect the future to be. So it's about letting go of position. Another way to sort of put this is, it's okay to have strong opinions, but you need to hold them lightly, right? You need to be able to be challenged without being defensive, because that's the way to have proper conversations about the future, to sort of enrich the conversation much more. Another old-timer from the field of future studies. I'm seeing I'm running out of time a little bit here. Is it okay I continue? Cyprian, looking at you. Good. Another old-timer, Herman Kahn, futurist, military strategist, very much popularized sort of scenario planning, so to speak. And he framed this thing that he called the expert problem. I see this all the time in the organizations that I work with. At C-suite level, I even see it with my dad. He's not a CEO or anything, but he's my dad, and he's old. This expert problem that really frames the approach that the more expert, the more experienced, the more trained you are within a certain field of expertise, the less likely you are to see solutions that are outside of that field. So if you're above 25 years old in this room, I think you should always question your initial response to any trends that you see. Right? Good. The expert problem. And it really is about cognitive biases. I read recently that there are more than 180 different cognitive biases. All of the things that really distorts our reasoning, that really sort of hampers our ability to make rational decisions. Cognitive biases. I've only sort of brought 5 of them here today that really relates to making decisions and more importantly, making decisions about the future. So if you're sitting here in this room and thinking, oh, change is bad for business. Do we have anyone who thinks that change is bad for business who would just, good old times? Probably a few. Then you might be predisposed to the status quo bias. And it easily leads you to just simply ignoring facts or ignoring information that challenges the way you currently look at things as an organization or as an individual. That's the status quo bias. Similar, we have the confirmation bias. And that is sort of the tendency that we tend to interpret selectively, right? We tend to interpret information in ways that sort of supports the confirmation that we hold on to. So it's similar to the status quo bias, but looking for information to always confirm us in our worldviews is something that's really, really strong, especially if it's around a topic that you're emotionally invested in, right? All of us are predisposed to this. I'm not talking about eliminating any of these biases. I'm just talking about being aware, because we're not able to eliminate any of these. Then the optimism bias. We probably have a lot of entrepreneurs here at this event. And optimism and sort of determination is super, super good when you're trying to achieve things. But at some point, optimism bias sort of tips over, so to speak, that you're holding on to this idea. This idea is so good that it simply can't fail, and you're not able to just accept the sunk cost that might be related, not only in entrepreneur, in startups, but in general, holding on to this idea because it's so good it can't fail. The expert problem, we talked about that, and groupthink fallacy, I don't think I need to talk too much about that. That's also something that we see way too often in sort of decision-making forums, where we have a lot of old white men in light blue shirts sort of making decisions. How convenient that we all agree this fast, right? About adding diversity to processes like this. Few more slides left. I think I was only given 15 minutes, but I was promised 25, so I'm going to stay on the stage for a little bit. When does the future start? That's something that I'm asked quite often, actually. And if I was a motivational speaker standing on this stage, I would probably say that the future starts now or something like that, right? That's not my message. I want to sort of approach this a little bit differently. When does the future start? And I want to introduce the concept of mental flexibility. I would normally say, sort of from a strategic foresight point of view, that the future starts, as a rule of thumb, 10 years from now. Because if we're not able to sort of look beyond the normal planning horizon of most organizations, 3, maybe even 5 years sometimes, then it really, really easily leads to path-dependent thinking. We're sort of stuck in the present a little bit, and we tend to just extrapolate the present into the future. If we go 10 years out, maybe a little bit more, then it's much, much easier for us to acknowledge that the future might unfold in completely new ways that we might not even be able to grasp at the moment. So it's easier for us to sort of have this free space to have conversations around completely different futures without being sort of shut down all the time that that's never going to happen or whatnot. Obviously, when we talk about decision making, we don't necessarily want to go 20, 30, or even 50 years out in the future, because then it very easily becomes too disconnected from strategic purpose, right? So a good rule of thumb in strategic foresight, I would say that the future starts 10 years from now to avoid path-dependent thinking and to nurture the mental flexibility. Okay? This whole keynote here is about sort of leveraging the importance of being able to create this reperception that I talked about a little bit earlier. So sort of working with the future, building different scenarios, having conversations on how the future might unfold, learning from the future to sort of facilitate this reperception in the present, right? And to leave you all on a high note, we all know Albert Einstein, very bright man. One of my favorite quotes of his is this one, that the world as we have created it is a process of our thinking, and it cannot be changed without changing our thinking. That was all for me. Thanks so much for listening. Happy to take a few questions.
I will look again at our trends report differently from now on to some extent.
Trends reports are good?
Are good, yeah, I know, I got it. Now, you will actually meet Simon again on this stage from 4:30. He's going to have a chat with Kasper from the Polish Institute for Future Studies. Future, not futures. So Eastern Europe. We're slowly getting the variable future perspective. We have, you can have a lot of questions for him then, but you can also meet him. We have a few spots left. So tomorrow from 2 to 5, we have a foresight, an intro to foresight class, and in the first 30 minutes, Simon will also join us. Now, let's pick a question. If there's a question in the audience, I have a lot. We have a question there, so if we can get a mic, the mic is coming.
Hi. You wanted to talk about the desired future and the probable future. Can we make a match between the two so we can increase the probability to have a more desirable future? Thank you.
Very good point. And it's never going to be like we're only working with plausible futures or preferable futures and whatnot. It is a mix all the time, it is. But my point here is that if you're sort of trying to work strategically with the future, if you're working with the future to inform organizational decision-making, then you need to be agnostic about the future, because the future, the preferred future sort of easily leads to organizational bias that we're just hoping, we're crossing our fingers and hoping for this future. We might do some actions that brings us closer to that future, and that might lead us to disregard futures that we don't necessarily like. But if what we're trying to achieve with the foresight exercise is coming up with a vision or a mission or whatever, where we want to actually be a participant in making transformations in society or whatnot, then the preferable futures comes to the forefront, I would say. But if it's about informing decision-making, then I would always claim that we need to be more agnostic about the futures and also acknowledge that not all futures are necessarily as desirable for us.
Cool. Well, thank you so much. We have plenty of time with Simon later on, and if you want, you can actually perhaps during the day see him at the Future Game in the other stage, where we have a lot of people that already signed up for sessions. I want to thank you so much, and I want to end with a metaphor. You know me, right? What is this? I'm going to ask you first.
You're asking me or you're asking me?
Yeah, what is this? What do you think this is?
This is a pedestal.
A pedestal, thank you. Anybody else? What is this? What do you think this is? Louder, if you... A what? Louder. A box. What box? Well, it's a black box. Thank you very much. So this is a black box. And I think sometimes the future is like a black box. You don't really know what's in it, but you can guess, and you can have an agnostic guess. And when we do that, we become more prepared. In the same time, if you want to talk more about preferred futures, you can see on the walls outside, and you can go later on at the coffee if you want. We have some spots left for a 2-day foresight exercise on preferred futures for Romania 2025. We talk about education, work, and PNRR tomorrow from 9, and then foresight, and then climate change and Bucharest on Sunday. Thank you so much. We're going to go to the...
I have a metaphor as well, real quick. The reason I said pedestal is that I don't want to be up here as a futurist. I think it's super important that futurists are not on a pedestal, but actually sort of being inclusive around working with the future. So another metaphor.
Yeah, true. Now, since we don't have time, but sometimes it's also the way you look at the future. And now it doesn't actually look like a pedestal anymore. It looks like a normal box.
Great.
Treasure box. Thank you so much.
Thanks.